So, one of my lamps blew earlier on today, and it's late, so I can't get one till tomorrow. So the room's even dingier than it was before. I sort of fiddled with the white balance to make it more colourful, and hey, orange room bad. This probably doesn't help. Anyway, I was thinking today about history because I've always been very keen on history and what we can learn from the past about the present. Um, it's said that those who fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it. That might or might not be true, but it's certainly interesting to look back at history. Um, I grew up in a Christian family, but I'm not myself Christian. I didn't lose my faith. I never really had any. I just didn't click with me. If you're Christian or any other religion, that's fine. Let's not argue about it. But I'm not. But I was because my parents are Christians, and we had Bibles in the house. So I've always been quite aware of Scripture and Christianity in general. My mother was in fact a Sunday school teacher for a while in the 70s. I also should say that here in England, in most cases, Christianity is much milder than in, say, the USA, where it's quite intense. Certainly in some areas. But I think generally, whereas here it's just, you go to church and there's old ladies wearing their Sunday hats and, you know, it's not a big deal. So I became aware of Christian history, of course. And one thing that interested me I remember this from a young age, was in the Bible story, the Christians start off being persecuted by everybody. And then they end up running the Roman Empire. They end up and then running Europe. They completely win. And they come from a position of being persecuted and a minority that nobody liked. And I was fascinated by the question of, well, how does that happen? Now, from a Christian perspective, people are likely to see it as, well, it was the will of God, or it was the good thing to happen, and it was the truth. Of course, it won through. But if you don't believe in God, you tend to look for more real world explanations. It doesn't seem natural that Christianity won. And my question sort of boiled down to, why didn't the pagans stop them? Now, I'm not saying they should have stopped them. I don't have a dog in this fight. I'm no more interested in worshipping Mithras or Pan or Dionysus as I am in worshipping Jesus. It just seemed odd to me that a culture which is entirely against Christianity didn't seem capable of preventing the Christians taking over, which they did, absolutely, to the extent that all the other religions were wiped out. They were suppressed. Now, there's a set of historical events that occurred, and they're interesting to discuss. But I used to think, what would it be like to go back in a time machine and experience that? Now, of course, it's a very long process. It's not like the Roman Empire snaps from one to the other overnight. But I've always imagined sort of walking into I'm not sure what they called them then, some place where you get a drink of wine. I should know the word for this, bibulum or something. And what are people discussing? Are they saying, what's that new building over there? Oh, I think it's one of those Christian churches, and someone goes, oh, I don't like the look of this. And someone goes, oh, they're only a few nutters, and they mean well and they help the poor. I'm sure they're very nice, really. And then somebody else goes, well, some of my slaves are Christians and I've been a bit worried, really. And someone else goes, well, my wife's been dabbling with it. She was dabbling with the Jews, and then now she's into this thing, silly woman, and so on. But then one day, later on, you stop your time machine and you find people being denounced for heresy, and someone saying that guy over there was doing pagan sacrifices, and sort of burn him, and let's tear down that shrine over there to Dionysus. It's the work of the devil. And everybody's in the religion now, and it's the normal thing. How do things go from one to the other? And I wondered what it was like, as I said, to experience it. And then some years ago, I realized I know what it's like. We are experiencing the same process in our current society, except that we have a new faith or belief system taking over everything. And you can call it what you like. It doesn't have a proper name as such. Social justice, intersectionalism, and so on. But there's no doubt in my mind that this is what we've seen. And I've begun to understand why the pagans didn't stop the Christians. Which, just to go back, they had a vested interest in doing so, because they were pagans. And even if they didn't mind Christianity being legalized, which I'm sure many of them didn't, once it started being enforced, they would have found that objectionable. And you would have thought they'd have risen up and stopped it. Now, Rome, unlike our modern society, was not a society averse to violence. Numerous emperors, the vast majority of emperors, it seems, ended their careers by being stabbed by somebody who wanted to be emperor instead. Actually, I'm not sure if it's a majority because there's a few dynasties in there, but it was certainly very common. There was one year when there was famously the year of 5 emperors, and the first 4 were all stabbed by the next one. So the idea that everyone just sat on their hands and said nothing and did nothing and were too shy to stand up to the authorities imposing Christianity doesn't seem to hold much water. All you've got to do is raise a legion and march on Rome, which people loved doing. They did all the time. In fact, Constantine, who was the first person to legalize Christianity with the Edict of Toleration, I believe it's called, he brought his legions all the way from Britain, fought his way across the continent, became one of the 4 emperors they had at the time. They had a system called the Tetrarchy, and then he killed all the others and ended up the sole emperor, and he declared an edict that Christianity was now tolerated, but then quite rapidly started moving to make it preferable. And there were a succession of steps in that. Now, the last pagan emperor was called Julian, and he's called Julian the Apostate by history because he actually tried to take Rome back to a form of paganism when there'd already been several Christian emperors. The form he wanted to take it back to was a bit strange. It was a kind of mishmash of them all. He tried to make another state religion that wasn't Christianity, because prior to Christianity, religions were private affairs. There were many of them. They all had their own shrines and so on. So he seemed to think that the solution was to create a sort of unified state paganism. And he was stabbed. He was stabbed by one of his soldiers, and it's generally thought, I believe, that he was a Christian who stabbed him. After that, there were no more pagan emperors. They were all Christians. And then when we get to the Emperor Theodosius, he made Christianity the only religion. He said it was illegal to be anything else. And that was the end of the matter. Now, there was a last gasp. A guy called Eugenius and a barbarian chief whose name I've forgotten, they decided to try to rebel against Theodosius in the West and become pagan. Now, Theodosius invaded, and at one point it looked like the notionally pagan side would win the battle. It was called the Battle of the Frigidus River, which just means the Battle of the Cold River. But then it went against them. I'm not a historian. It's not worth going through all that. And after that, that's the end of any attempt to revive non-Christian society. But it was already really long dead by then. In fact, Eugenius himself was a Christian. He just believed in toleration of all religions, or was persuaded to stand for that. What he really believed, we don't really know. And that's sort of reminiscent of this current situation where a couple of days ago, a bunch of predominantly, I believe, all left-wing people, Noam Chomsky, a man of the very profound left, J.K. Rowling, a woman very strongly associated with left-wing politics in Britain, who's a supporter of New Labour. She's a progressive and has gone out of her way to try and persuade everybody that everybody in her books was gay. I wouldn't call it virtue signalling. I think she really wishes she'd made them into a great gay panorama, so that she could have been ahead of the curve. But whatever. These are left-wing people, and they wrote a letter asking for freedom of speech. And they've been condemned and cancelled. They said cancel culture is a bad thing. It stifles speech. Even people we don't like should be allowed to speak. And they've been cancelled and told they can't speak. I saw one YouTuber, one who I think is quite a sensible person, using terms like right-wing and bigot about J.K. Rowling, which to anyone in England is, Britain, is the most ludicrous thing. She's well known to have been a big Labour person, hates Conservatives, all the rest of it. So you're at that point now where we've gone from the Edict of Toleration. We're now into a place where at least it's not polite to be anything other than woke. We have very strong laws now which make it illegal to disagree with being woke. And if you were to disagree, you can be sent to prison, or you can be fined. You can be sacked from your job, because these requirements are woven through the workplace. They're woven through the education system. They're woven through the bureaucracy, so that whatever you may believe in your private life, you certainly can't utter it in any meaningful public space. And we know that, of course, social media and video platforms will use any excuse to label as a heretic anyone who doesn't agree with the woke ideology. So the next stage is really just absolute hegemony of the woke. There won't be anyone who dares to be unwoke for fear of heresy. If we take the analogy between the rise of Christianity and the rise of the woke, then in a sense you might see the Donald Trump Brexit, the populists, whatever that word, which apparently it's offensive to be populist, because democracy is populist, and we don't like democracy because it lets ordinary people make up their own minds. You can't have that. Anyway, in the historical analogy, it makes you wonder whether Trump and the like are Julian the Apostate. That last attempt by the political leader to return to a state of toleration for anything other than the one true faith. So back to that question, how did it happen? And does that have any lessons for us? Well, Christianity got power because it had an emperor on its side, Constantine, came to power with the backing of Christians who were concentrated in the large cities in the East. It's an urban phenomenon, much like wokeism. And from there, he just began implementing it. Of course, this wasn't a democratic government. The Senate had ceased to have any power. What the emperor said went, goes. Why didn't people stop him? Well, they couldn't organize. There wasn't a pagan unity. And this, in fact, is what it seems Julian tried to do. He tried to make pagans an identity group, in a sense. The Christians had power because they were all together. They were all on the same page. They might be fighting amongst themselves, but they would fight everybody else first. And I think an analogy for why things often are passed in, and let's get away from woke for a minute, but let's suppose the government wants to pass a law against fishing, like angling with a rod. There's quite a lot of anglers in the country, but they're not a pressure group. They're not an identity group. They're just people who angle. Whereas a group campaigning against them are an organized core. They've got a network and they've got a process of pushing their ideas. So they get more access to power than the people who aren't unified. So if that were to happen, I might think, well, that's terribly unfair. I don't angle myself, but it's not fair to those people. But it's not an interest of mine. So I'm probably not going to start a revolution over it, or even, to be honest, march in the streets. I'd probably do what everybody does. I'd grumble on the internet and say, oh, this is terribly unfair. And then it would happen anyway. And this is what happens. So the first point is that the opposition, although they may well be greater in number, or at least neutral people may be greater in number. Perhaps I should rephrase that. You often have a small core of people who want to pass a measure, a group of people interested who want to oppose it. These are the fishermen. And then you've got this big spodge in the middle of people who are varying degrees of not that bothered either way. They probably might think it's unfair, but they're not that motivated. So this group, you can't see my hands, can you? The group of motivated campaigners are the ones who get the forward motion, and everybody else is milling about. Because remember, there isn't just one issue. There's many issues, and different groups of the mass population have different interests and different biases. It's not organized on the anti side. So if you look at today, there isn't an organized force against wokeism. There are people with various different quibbles about it, different arguments about it. And then one core group, that Japanese heart thing, there's one core group who are very, very keen on pushing it through. And so the opposition is disorganized. It can be divided and conquered. So that's the first issue. The second is the access to power. The Christians had access to power through Constantine, through a crucial early stage of implementation. It's often seen as a grassroots movement. It's typified as people, as a few slaves hiding in catacombs, praying for salvation. But in fact, these guys, who were probably less than 10% of the population at the time, were able to get an emperor, a very successful emperor, on their side. Because we've got to be clear, Constantine was a ruthless, brutal, model Roman emperor. He was just the guy that can run the Roman Empire, because he was completely ruthless and self-centered and self-interested and driven by the lust for power. So they rode his coattails. They were then able to go into the bureaucracy, and from there they could spread it everywhere. while bishops of Constantine and succeeding emperors could constantly nudge their elbows and say, you need to bring in a law about this, you need to bring in a law about that. That heresy, can you really tolerate it going on? Just as an aside, I'm not a cynic about Constantine. I think he really was a Christian. I don't think he just did it for the power, because of the fact that he introduced many Christian measures in the law during his reign, which he didn't need to do. He could have pushed them all off the proverbial under the bus. He could have pushed them under the bus, but he didn't push them under the bus. So where's the power these days? Well, it's actually not in an emperor. It's certainly not in a monarch. And we certainly don't get monarchs and leaders by people stabbing each other, although they may do it metaphorically. The centre place where this faith has attacked is in education. By taking education, they have been able to turn the education system into a system of conversion and radicalization. From there, it spreads out into the bureaucracy. It spreads out from there into government. It spreads into the schools. It spreads into the corporations. Those people leave university taking it with them. And it covers the whole, it gains a sense of credibility which it otherwise wouldn't have. So instead of getting an emperor to implement their ideology, they took control of something else that Western civilization has, which others didn't, which previous civilizations didn't have in the same degree, which was a center of knowledge upon which everybody relies, which was academia. So I'm going to stop there because I'll do another video. But the simple fact is, what was it like to live through the conversion of Rome from paganism to Christianity? We know. It's just like what's happening now. We're living through history, and there may be no going back. Did you like my video? If you like my video, please like and subscribe.